Let us settle for a moment with a gentle wondering. What if the Earth itself, in the slow patience of its layers, holds memories of things long gone, memories older than any book or tale? We look at the ground beneath us and see only soil or stone, but hidden within are records written not with ink but with time. A layer of ash may tell of a great fire. A sudden band of clay may whisper of a flood. Ice holds bubbles of ancient air, like a quiet archive of forgotten climates. When we speak of layers of time, we mean these natural records, stacked gently one upon another, each holding a fragment of the past. Just as a photo album captures moments of a family, the Earth captures traces of its own long story. The scale is vast. Where a lifetime is counted in decades, and a city in centuries, the ground beneath us counts in millennia, in millions of years. To read this book of stone requires patience. Sediments settle grain by grain, and only after long ages do they become the pages we now study. Yet, as with any book, some pages are missing. Erosion, earthquakes, shifting seas, they tear out chapters without leaving a mark. This is why the record of our own presence, fragile and small in comparison, can vanish almost completely. We might imagine a library where half the shelves are missing, and where the remaining pages are smudged, half words blurred, others erased. That is how geologists, scientists who study the Earth's structure, must work. They piece together stories from fragments, cautious not to fill gaps with certainty, but only with possibilities. Now let us pause on how these layers form. Imagine a river carrying silt after rain. The water slows, the grains fall, and over time the silt hardens into rock. Each flood adds another thin sheet. In ice, snowfall presses upon older snow, compacting year after year until bubbles of air remain trapped like tiny time capsules. In lakes, pollen drifts down season by season, leaving microscopic records of vanished forests. These are the mechanisms of memory. They are simple, yet steady, and together they form the grand archive of the Earth. But this archive is incomplete. Here lies the limit of what we know. Where layers are missing, there may once have been records of life, of climate, perhaps even of things made by hand. Yet those layers may be washed away forever. When we say absence of evidence, it does not mean evidence of absence. It means only silence, and silence can mean many things. Now we may ask what language these traces speak. The layers carry not words but signals. A sudden rise in certain chemicals might point to volcanic fire. A thin scattering of rare metals can mark the fall of an asteroid. Shifts in isotopes, tiny variations in atoms, can whisper of changing climate. If human activity, however ancient, had reached unusual scales, we might hope to see faint fingerprints here too. Slight increases in pollutants, unexplained scars in bedrock, unusual concentrations of melted material, these are the subtle hints one could search for. Let us take a small thought experiment. Imagine a city built and thriving, then lost. In 1,000 years, stone walls crumble. In 10,000, metals corrode. In 100,000, ice sheets may grind across the land. What remains is little more than a smudge in sediment, perhaps a faint layer of ash mixed with traces of altered minerals. If that city had launched fire into the sky, leaving scorch marks or strange compounds in the soil, those too would fade, but not instantly. They might persist long enough to blend into the natural record, becoming indistinguishable from volcanic fire or lightning strike. Now stretch that experiment further to millions of years. Tectonic plates move, mountains rise and fall, seas open and close. The surface of the Earth is recycled. Very little from such a depth of time survives intact. And yet, sometimes fossils do. A leaf pressed in stone, a shell preserved with delicate ridges, even the imprint of a raindrop. These are reminders that small things can endure, not always grand. Monuments, but tiny traces. If nature can preserve such fragile details, then perhaps, though unlikely, traces of other fragile things may also remain, waiting in the layers. We end softly here. The Earth's layers are not a perfect record, but they are the closest we have to memory beyond memory. They remind us that much is lost, but not all. They teach us humility, for the silence of deep time is not a denial, only a pause. And so we linger in the thought that what has vanished may still leave whispers, waiting in stone, in ice, in soil, for those patient enough to listen. What if, hidden within the layers of earth, whole stories have already been written and then erased? Let us drift for a moment into that possibility. We stand on familiar ground, but beneath our feet lies not a solid surface, rather a slow-flowing archive of shifting layers, pressed and folded across unimaginable spans of time. Each layer of soil, each band of stone, each sheet of ice holds a record of what once was. Yet not all records survive. Many are erased before anyone could ever read them. We move now gently into the vast scale of time. For us, a century feels long. Yet in geological rhythm, a century is less than a heartbeat. Continents drift, oceans rise and fall, mountains lift and wear away, all while human memory measures only the smallest fractions of these motions. Within such immensity, even entire civilizations might be little more than dust upon the page. To understand this, let us pause with the image of a sandcastle by the shore. It stands briefly, shaped with care, but when the tide returns, almost nothing remains. What we see with sand, the earth performs over millennia. Whole landscapes are washed away, and the record grows thin. Now we may slow ourselves to look at the processes. Sediment covers what falls upon it. Dust, ash, pollen, shells, each layer added quietly to the last. Over time, pressure hardens these sediments into rock. Ice performs a similar work, trapping air bubbles, holding traces of past climates in delicate crystal. Yet while these mechanisms preserve, others destroy. Wind scours. Rain dissolves. Heat from within the earth melts stone back into molten flow. And so the record is always partial, always fragile. This is why archaeologists and geologists alike speak with care, aware of the gaps between what is found and what may once have been. The gaps are not small, they are vast. Now we rest a little with what we do not know. When a layer is missing, we cannot tell what it once contained. Was it forest, or desert, or city? We cannot be certain. We can only infer by what surrounds it. It is like finding two surviving pages of a book with the middle torn away. We may guess what once filled the space, but certainty is beyond reach. This is the quiet boundary of our knowledge. Yet, even without certainty, the earth speaks in subtle ways. There are signals, faint but meaningful. A sudden presence of charcoal may mark fires. Layers rich in tiny shells may tell of ancient seas. Shifts in the ratio of oxygen isotopes whisper of cold or warmth. Even rare metals scattered in thin layers can mark the fall of objects from space. These traces are not always obvious. They are like faint footprints in wet grass, visible only when the light strikes at the right angle. Still, they tell us that the Earth has a language, one written in chemistry, texture, and pattern. Now, let us step softly into a thought experiment. Imagine a time far before our own, where people had built, created, perhaps even reached for the sky. Their work stood firm, but then centuries passed. Stone crumbled. Iron rusted. Fire burned away the rest. In 1,000 years, only fragments remained. In 10,000, even those fragments had merged into the soil. Then came rivers and glaciers, grinding away the land. Now imagine we stand millions of years later. Would any trace remain at all? Perhaps a faint smudge of altered minerals, perhaps a tiny chemical signal buried within a layer of clay. Not proof, not certainty, only a hint. Now imagine further that the land itself shifted. The layer folded deep into the earth, recycled into magma, emerging later as volcanic rock. If that happened, even the faintest trace would be gone. This is the patience of geology, and it does not guard human works with care. It erases more often than it preserves. And yet, as we reflect, we must remember that some things endure. Fossil shells remain, delicate but stubborn. Traces of pollen still sleep within lake beds tens of thousands of years old. Even the faint impact of a raindrop can last in stone for eons. These small survivals remind us that while much is lost, not everything disappears. Fragile details sometimes outlast the grandest monument. From this, we learn humility. The Earth's layers are archives, but incomplete ones, like manuscripts with missing pages. They invite us to read with patience, to imagine with care, and to accept uncertainty. We cannot say with confidence what is forever erased, only that silence is not the same as absence. And so we end here, softly, resting in the thought that time itself is both a keeper and an eraser, offering us fragments of what came before, while hiding the rest in its deep and quiet folds. What if the records we most often trust were never meant to last? Let us rest for a while with the idea of fragility, with the quiet truth that almost everything we make is temporary. A page of paper turns brittle, a wooden beam softens and decays, iron rusts into flakes, even copper darkens and crumbles if left to the air. Stone seems firm, yet given enough time, wind and rain turn it into sand. When we think about deep time, measured not in centuries but in thousands and millions of years, almost all human works appear as fleeting as shadows on water. We might imagine for a moment an ancient city, full of walls, roofs, tools, and script. A few hundred years after its people are gone, roofs collapse, wood rots, paint fades. 1,000 years later, stone blocks remain but are broken, tumbled, scattered. After 10,000 years, soil has swallowed much of it, and plants grow where halls once stood. After 100,000 years, glaciers or rivers may have passed through, grinding stone into gravel. What once was clear and solid has become invisible, part of the landscape itself. This process is not dramatic but patient, a slow breath of the earth. Now let us pause and consider why records are fragile. Most of what humans create is built for immediate use, not for eternity. A clay pot carries food, not the promise of surviving millennia. A metal tool serves a hand, not the distant future. Even great monuments, like towers and bridges, are kept alive only by care and repair. Without such tending, they decline quickly. The materials themselves obey natural rules. Paper is eaten by insects and fungi. Metals oxidize, reacting with oxygen in air and water until they turn to dust. Stone, though strong, cracks with freezing water or dissolves with acid rain. These are not failures but natural endings, as natural as leaves falling in autumn. We may also note that archives of knowledge, those careful collections of words, are no safer. Scrolls burn. Libraries collapse. Digital files vanish when the medium that holds them breaks down. A memory stored on fragile clay, delicate paper, or even magnetic tape cannot survive the reach of thousands of years without protection. And protection itself is rare. The absence of such records does not mean that nothing existed. It only means that what was made has followed the path of all fragile things. Now we can think of the language of traces. Fragility leaves its own signals, though faint. For example, when wood rots away, it may leave a dark stain in soil where its fibers once lay. When metals corrode, unusual chemical patterns remain in sediment. When paper or cloth vanish, sometimes only ashes or fragments of ink are left. These are not clear records, but quiet shadows of what once was. Archaeologists often rely on such indirect evidence, like a darkened patch of earth that hints at a wooden post long vanished. It reminds us that what survives is often not the thing itself, but a subtle echo. Let us take a small thought experiment. Imagine a rocket launched long ago, its frame made of alloys, its tanks filled with fuel. At first it soars upward, leaving a scorched patch of ground. Years pass. The metal corrodes, the pad crumbles. After centuries, the rocket itself, if it ever returned, lies in pieces, oxidized and broken. After thousands of years, only traces of unusual compounds remain in the soil. After millions, the entire site may be ground away, folded into layers of rock. perhaps leaving only the faintest chemical fingerprint, impossible to distinguish from natural events. Now extend this experiment to a whole civilization. What remains in deep time is not their machines, not their libraries, but perhaps only fragments of pottery, faint changes in soil chemistry, or unexpected layers of ash. In such silence, we cannot be sure what was or was not achieved. The absence of evidence tells us only that records are fragile, not that the event itself never occurred. We may, for a moment, rest with this thought, that history is not a neat path, but a scattered trail of survivals. Most things vanish, but a few endure by chance, like shells on a shore after the tide. The lesson is humility. We cannot lean too heavily on what is missing, nor declare with certainty what never was. We can only move carefully, acknowledging the fragile nature of human work and the patient erasures of time. And so, as we let this reflection settle, we find ourselves in a quiet balance. Fragility does not deny the possibility of past achievements. It simply reminds us why they may no longer be visible. In the silence of absence, we are left with both caution and wonder, a soft pause in which the unknown remains open. What if, among the countless things that vanish, some traces resist the passing of time, standing quietly while everything else fades? Let us move softly into this idea, into the thought that certain materials and certain marks may endure far longer than others. The earth is a patient recycler, yet even in its endless cycles, some remnants cling on, like small stones left behind after a tide has pulled everything else away. We may begin with clay. When clay is shaped and then fired in heat, it transforms. The fire rearranges its structure, making it harder, more resistant. A simple vessel, once touched by hands, can remain buried for thousands of years, long after wood and fabric are gone. In this way, clay becomes a silent witness. Even broken into fragments, it preserves the memory of shaping, of design, of intention. Another material is metal. Most metals corrode, but some alloys are more resilient. Bronze, for instance, resists decay longer than iron. Gold barely changes at all. A tiny bead of gold can survive in soil for millennia, shining with almost the same surface it had when first made. Yet even these enduring things carry their limit. Over vast stretches of time, erosion and geology still act, grinding, melting, scattering. Stone itself, carved into monuments or markers, can persist for ages. We see examples in pyramids, temples, megaliths. Their survival does not mean they are eternal, only that they have lasted long enough for us to see them. If time were stretched further, tens of thousands of centuries, many would crumble back into grains indistinguishable from the natural ground. Now we may pause on scars that endure. A quarry cut into rock may outlast the buildings made from its stones. Terraces carved into hillsides can remain faintly visible as ridges in the land long after the society that shaped them is gone. Fire, too, leaves signals. Clay hardened by fire, soil discolored by intense heat, layers of ash compacted within sediment, these can survive and be read like faint signatures of events long past. In this way, even when objects vanish, the marks of their making may remain. But here lies the challenge. Such traces are ambiguous. A scar in rock may come from human tools or from natural fracture. A layer of ash may come from forest fire or from human hearth. With time, the line between natural and artificial blurs. This is why we must step gently, never forcing certainty where only possibility exists. Now we can think of the language of these enduring traces. Archaeologists often speak of diagnostic markers, signals that reveal human presence. For example, pottery fragments are such markers, because their shapes and materials are not made by chance in nature. Likewise, smelting slag, the glassy byproduct of melting metal, has no natural twin. These are reliable signs. Yet beyond such clear cases, the language grows subtle. Soil chemistry may show unusual concentrations of elements. Stone may bear patterns of wear that suggest cutting. These faint hints form a kind of quiet alphabet, which must be read carefully, letter by letter. Let us imagine a thought experiment. Suppose a culture reached a great achievement, perhaps even reaching beyond the Earth. At the height of its activity, there would be fires, tools, alloys, structures. For a few centuries, traces would be strong. But then collapse came. Centuries passed, and wood vanished. Millennia passed, and iron dissolved. After 100,000 years, what would remain? Likely fragments of fired clay, perhaps a scatter of bronze or gold, maybe scars in landscapes where quarries or launch sites once stood. After 1,000,000 years, even less, fragments ground into sand, scars softened into hills. Only the most resistant traces, perhaps in deep caves or buried under sediment, would still whisper of what once was. This is the rhythm of endurance and erasure. From this, we see that even durable things are not immune to time, they are only slower to fade. And so we arrive at a gentle truth. Some traces last longer than others, but none last forever. The absence of enduring marks does not mean an event never happened, only that the Earth's long patience has hidden or erased it. The presence of traces, however faint, reminds us that even in deep time, echoes can survive. They may be incomplete, fragile, difficult to read, yet they open windows to what came before. We end with this balance. The traces that endure are not proof, but they are possibilities, resting quietly in soil, in stone, in the subtle scars of the land. They invite us to imagine, to listen carefully to the whispers of matter, and to remember that silence itself is not the same as absence. What if the sky itself could serve as an archive, a place where traces of past efforts might linger longer than they do on Earth? Let us drift into this thought with care, remembering that the atmosphere above us and the space beyond are not empty, but layered with quiet signals and slow changes. For as long as people have looked upward, the heavens have been more than a background. They are both a canvas for imagination and, in their own way, a record of what has touched them. To understand this, we must pause on scale. The air above us is thin compared to the earth below, but it stretches high, merging into space. Within this vastness, particles drift, radiation moves, and objects orbit for years before falling. The sky is not static. It has currents and storms, like the sea, yet it also has regions where motion is slow and change is rare. These are places where traces, once left, can remain for long spans of time. Now let us move gently into how such traces might form. Every rocket that climbs leaves a trail in the upper air, a brief scar of burned fuel. For us today, these marks vanish quickly. Winds scatter them, the sky clears. Yet if attempts had been made long ago, there might have been larger signs. Changes in certain chemicals high in the atmosphere, unusual patterns of soot or particles. Over centuries, these would settle into ice, into soil, into oceans, leaving faint records of their passing. Beyond the air, in orbit, the sky collects its own debris. Satellites today circle the Earth for decades, some for centuries, before gravity and friction pull them down. If earlier machines had been placed there, fragments might have drifted for a time, colliding, breaking, spreading. Eventually most would fall, burning in fire at re-entry, but while they lasted, the sky would have held them, like seeds floating on a slow current. We must acknowledge the limits here. The atmosphere cleans itself. Dust falls, particles scatter, traces are diluted. Space around Earth, though vast, is unstable on geological timescales. A fragment that seems timeless in orbit today is, in truth, short-lived when measured in millennia. This means we should not expect direct survival of ancient machines above us, but indirect signals. Subtle chemical shifts in ice layers, faint anomalies in sediment, statistical outliers in cosmic dust. These may still linger. Now let us pause and imagine how such signals might appear. Suppose, far back in time, a culture launched fire into the sky. For a few years, the atmosphere carried their exhaust. Particles spread, drifting into polar regions, where snow trapped them in layers of ice. Thousands of years later, cores of ice might still hold these anomalies, thin lines of altered chemistry sandwiched between natural cycles of snowfall. Suppose further that an object had orbited for centuries before falling. Its fragments burned upon re-entry, scattering rare alloys into soil. Over long spans, the fragments would weather away, yet unusual concentrations of certain metals might persist as chemical echoes, detectable though no longer recognizable as tools. In this way, the sky becomes both stage and archive. Its records are not direct inscriptions but whispers, subtle, distributed, hidden within other patterns. They require patient listening, for they are not loud announcements but faint harmonies within the larger music of natural change. Before we move on, we should note that stories themselves have always tied to the sky. Myths of chariots of fire, beings descending from stars, paths drawn across the heavens, these are cultural reflections, not scientific data. Yet they remind us that the sky has always been seen as a place of passage, of contact, of possibility. Whether real attempts were ever made or not, the sky has long been imagined as the place where the human story might extend. We return now to the balance of knowledge and uncertainty. The sky can hold traces, but not forever. The lack of visible evidence today does not prove nothing was ever there. It shows only that if traces existed, they were either too faint, too scattered, or too well hidden in the natural rhythms of atmosphere and space. Silence in this archive is not emptiness. It is only a reminder of how fragile signals are across deep time. And so we close softly, with the thought that the heavens may indeed carry memories, though in the most delicate forms. A line in ice, a trace in dust, a pattern in story. The sky, vast and quiet, remains both a mirror of nature and, perhaps, a keeper of faint echoes of human ambition. It invites us to look upward not only with wonder but also with patience, knowing that what lingers there may be subtle beyond measure, and yet still part of the long record of our shared journey. What if the oldest stories, carried not on stone or metal but in words, held faint echoes of journeys skyward? Let us settle into this thought gently, remembering that tales often travel further than objects. Myths can outlive monuments. They drift across generations, reshaped with every telling, yet still preserving fragments of older patterns. In this way, a story can act as a vessel, lighter than clay but sometimes more enduring. We must place ourselves within the scale of human memory. Written texts are young compared to the age of the earth. The oldest fragments of writing reach back only a few thousand years. Beyond them stretch millennia of oral traditions, spoken by firesides, sung in rituals, remembered in cycles of seasons. These stories shift like rivers, eroding here, depositing there, carrying fragments downstream. They are not precise records, yet they may preserve impressions, like a shadow of a shape long gone. Myths of flight, of fiery chariots, of beings arriving from or returning to the sky are found in many cultures. In one land, a god rides thunder. In another, a hero ascends on wings. In yet another, a people tell of teachers descending from the stars. Most scholars see these as metaphor, reflections of storms, of comets, of human longing. Yet, some pause at the recurrence of such themes. Could they, however faintly, preserve memory of real attempts to rise higher than birds? Now we must note carefully the limit. Stories are fluid. They change with each generation. What one age meant literally, another may retell symbolically. What began as memory of an unusual event may, over centuries, become transformed into legend, wrapped in symbols and sacred meaning. This fragility means we cannot treat stories as direct evidence, but they can serve as hints, suggesting directions for more grounded searches. The language of myths is not data in the same sense as stone or isotope. It is a softer kind of signal, carried in repeated patterns, in motifs that recur across distant cultures. If many groups, separated by space and time, tell of ascent to the skies, it does not prove such ascent occurred, but it does suggest a shared human fascination, or perhaps, at most, a faint echo of experience. Now we can rest with a thought experiment. Suppose a people once attempted a flight, perhaps not to the stars but to the edge of the sky. Imagine it was rare, perhaps only a handful of attempts, and the material traces were fragile, soon lost to time. Yet those who witnessed it would remember. They would tell their children of the fire, the noise, the climb into the sky. Generations later, those words would be reshaped. The fire becomes a god's chariot, the noise becomes thunder, the ascent becomes a passage to heaven. After centuries, the original event is no longer remembered clearly, only its impression remains. Later still, the impression itself is woven into sacred text or oral cycle, passed forward as myth. And we, looking back across millennia, would no longer be able to tell whether the story began as memory or as imagination. This is the difficulty and the beauty of cultural traces. They are fragile, but they endure. They are imprecise, but they travel. They outlast stone sometimes, carried by voices, preserved in ritual, repeated until they become part of the rhythm of a people. Now let us pause on what we do not know. We cannot separate with confidence metaphor from memory. We cannot date the first telling of most myth. We cannot trace their path with certainty. What we can do is notice patterns, compare themes, and remain open to possibilities. This is not proof, but it is not nothing. It is a quiet signal, softer than data but still worth attending to. And so, as we let this reflection settle, we may find ourselves holding two truths. Myths are not reliable evidence of forgotten spaceflight. Yet they remind us that for as long as we have been human, we have imagined the sky as a place of passage. Whether this imagination came only from dreams or also from rare memories, we cannot say. But the repetition of such visions across cultures keeps the question alive. We close softly here, with the thought that stories themselves are a kind of archive, not of events as they truly were, but of how they were remembered, reshaped, and cherished. They are whispers across time, fragile yet enduring, leaving us with a gentle awareness that silence in matter does not erase the voices that continue to echo in myth. What if knowledge itself is not permanent, but a fragile current, flowing through time and easily lost? Let us rest a while with this thought, for history offers us many reminders. Civilizations have risen, gathered wisdom, and then faded, leaving only fragments. Great libraries once held the work of countless minds, yet fire, neglect, or simple chance erased much of what they preserved. The Library of Alexandria is the most often remembered example, but it was not alone. Clay tablets broken, scrolls burned, manuscripts forgotten in abandoned monasteries, all remind us that memory stored in human symbols is vulnerable. Now let us pause on scale. Written knowledge, compared to the age of the earth, is young. 5,000 years, perhaps a little more, cover the span of recorded words. Before that, traditions were carried only by voice. Even within the time of writing, the survival of texts has been selective. What we read today are the survivors, the fragments spared by luck and circumstance. Whole schools of thought may once have thrived, now known only by a few mentions in the margins of later works. This fragility matters when we imagine lost achievements. Even if something remarkable had been known, it could have disappeared with the fall of its keepers. The mechanisms of loss are simple, yet powerful. Papyrus dries and crumbles. Ink fades in damp air. Clay breaks. Storage places are destroyed by flood, by fire, by war. Oral traditions, too, shift. With each retelling, meanings change, details are added or forgotten. In a few generations, memory becomes legend, legend becomes myth, and the original source is gone. The limits of our knowledge rest here. We cannot know what was once written and then erased. We cannot know what was spoken and then silenced. We can only acknowledge that what survives is not the full record, only a narrow window into the vastness of what was. Now let us think of the language of traces left by vanished knowledge. Sometimes the loss of texts is noticed through silence, gaps in continuity, sudden breaks in a tradition. At times, we find indirect signs, like references to earlier works that no longer exist. An author may mention a book we can no longer read. A later scientist may cite an experiment of which only a fragment remains. These small echoes serve as markers, reminding us that more once lived beneath the surface. A thought experiment may help us see this more clearly. Imagine a civilization today with libraries, archives, and digital stores. Imagine it suffers a collapse. At first, the works remain, but without care they begin to fade. Paper decays within centuries. Digital records fail even faster when the machines to read them no longer exist. After 1,000 years, only fragments are left, perhaps in places of unusual preservation, a dry cave, a sealed chest. After 10,000 years, even those fragments may be gone. What remains would be indirect. Perhaps references carved on stone or symbols that survived in rituals, separated from their original meaning. We would not know the full scope of knowledge, only hints and shadows. If this can happen to us, it may have happened before. Knowledge can advance, spread, and then disappear, leaving only traces too faint to interpret. And so we must hold this idea with care. The absence of records does not mean absence of learning. It only means absence of preservation. Silence in the archive is not silence of the mind. Now we let this settle into a gentle pause. Knowledge is not a steady mountain but a flowing river, branching, sometimes vanishing underground, then surfacing again in unexpected places. What was once known may be lost. What is lost may later be rediscovered. This rhythm reminds us to be humble with the fragments we hold. They may be enough to suggest much, but never enough to close the question fully. What if skills once learned were later forgotten, slipping quietly from human hands as if they had never existed? We may rest a moment with this thought, because history shows us such disappearances often. Knowledge is not always a steady climb upward. It moves in waves, sometimes advancing, sometimes retreating, sometimes vanishing entirely. The loss of craft can feel surprising to us now, yet it has happened many times before. Let us gently recall familiar examples. Roman builders made a concrete that grew stronger with time, able to endure seawater for centuries. That recipe was lost for over 1,000 years, rediscovered only with modern chemistry. Damascus steel, once prized for its strength and beauty, was created through complex methods of forging and tempering. When the tradition faded, the exact technique disappeared as well, leaving later generations only with rumors of its qualities. Even simple skills, such as making certain dyes, medicines, or instruments, have slipped away and been relearned with effort. These patterns remind us that knowledge is not permanent. It depends on memory, on teaching, on communities who practice and refine it. If those chains are broken, even advanced techniques can fade into silence. Now let us pause to consider how forgetting works. Skills are carried through repetition. A potter shapes clay, and an apprentice learns by watching. A smith works metal, and the craft continues through generations. When the chain is interrupted, through war, through famine, through migration, the knowledge may vanish in a single lifetime. Written notes help, but they are rarely complete. Instructions without practice are like a recipe without a cook. They preserve words, but not the subtle feel of the hand. This is why rediscovery often takes centuries. We may know something once existed, but not how it was done. Here we see the limits of our knowing. We can observe the finished works of ancient peoples, but not always the steps by which they were made. Sometimes we experiment, reconstruct, guess. At times we succeed in recreating. At other times, the original process remains hidden, its subtleties dissolved in the flow of time. The absence of knowledge today does not mean it never was. It means only that the chain of memory was broken. Now let us think of the language of traces such forgetting leave. Fragments of unusual alloys, objects with properties we cannot yet explain, or ruins built with techniques difficult to reproduce. These are hints of lost skill. They do not shout, they whisper. a wall that resists weather beyond expectation, a tool with a composition rare for its age, a vessel shaped with precision suggesting methods more advanced than assumed. None of these proves extraordinary achievement. They are only signals that human ability is not always linear, that skills can appear, vanish, and reappear again. A thought experiment can help us see this more clearly. Imagine a culture that develops advanced methods of building machines. For a time, the knowledge spreads and machines are built. Then the culture collapses. Survivors focus on food, on survival, on immediate need. The specialized skills fade. After a few generations, no one remembers how to make the machines. What remains are fragments of metal, too corroded to reveal their full design. Later generations might find them, puzzled, unable to recreate them. Thousands of years later, the fragments themselves are gone, and only faint legends of powerful tools remain. In this way, even great advances can be swallowed by forgetting. Stretch this experiment further. Suppose attempts were once made to reach beyond the earth. If they were rare, and if the skills were lost with their keepers, then only fragile traces would remain. A chemical mark in soil, a story of fire in the sky, perhaps an unusual fragment of alloy. Nothing clear, nothing complete. Just hints, scattered like faint stars in a cloudy sky. From this we may draw a gentle conclusion. The loss of skills is not unusual. It is part of the rhythm of human history. Knowledge flows and recedes, carried by memory and broken when memory fails. The silence we see in the record does not tell us with certainty what was or was not achieved. It only reminds us that forgetting is as natural as remembering. And so we let this reflection rest. Forgotten technologies may be gone, yet their traces can linger, faint and ambiguous. They invite us to listen carefully, without haste, to the quiet rhythm of time, where absence does not mean impossibility, only the passing of memory into silence. What if reaching beyond the earth was always less a question of imagination than of sheer scale, of the immense energy needed to lift matter against gravity's pull? Let us linger on this idea, because it places the challenge not in myth or symbol, but in the language of physics, where weight must be overcome and distance must be crossed. To rise from the surface of the earth into space requires speed, not just height. This speed is called escape velocity, a simple term for the speed at which something no longer falls back. For Earth, it is over 11 kilometers per second. We can picture it by imagining a stone thrown upward. Tossed lightly, it falls back quickly. Thrown harder, it rises higher before returning. To leave entirely, it must be thrown with such force that Earth's pull can no longer reclaim it. Rockets achieve this not in a single throw, but by pushing constantly until the needed speed is reached. Now let us pause with the scale of energy this demands. To launch a single small craft requires fuel many times heavier than the craft itself. Engines must focus immense power, channeling it upward with precision. The traces of such power would be distinctive: scorched ground, unusual residues in soil, large structures built to hold machines. In our time, we see these marks at launch sites, where concrete is blackened and metal is bent by heat. If something similar had occurred in a distant age, the traces might once have been there too. But here we meet the quiet limits of time. Soil erodes, rain washes, plants reclaim. Over centuries, even great fires leave only thin layers of ash. Over millennia, even large structures sink into earth or are worn away by wind. The absence of obvious remains today does not prove the absence of ancient attempts. It only reminds us that the record of such activity would be fragile. Still, we can think of indirect signs. A rocket burning fuel might release compounds not normally present in natural fires. Some of these might settle into sediments, preserved as thin chemical lines in lakes or ice. A launch might leave behind altered minerals in the soil, fused by extreme heat. If we looked closely enough, we might detect patterns that seem unusual against the background of nature. Yet, as always, we must be cautious. Volcanic eruptions, lightning strikes, and wildfires can also melt and scorch with great intensity. Their signals, written into stone and soil, can resemble those of human fire. Distinguishing the two is delicate, requiring more than a single clue. Let us take a thought experiment to follow this further. Imagine a small society develops the means to build a rocket. They gather materials, refine fuels, construct engines. A launch is made. For a few days, the ground near the site bears clear marks: burned rock, blackened soil, twisted fragments. After a few seasons, plants grow back, covering the scars. After a few centuries, weather breaks down the metal, rain carries away residues, the land reshaped. 1,000 years later, what remains is faint, perhaps a thin band of altered soil, detectable only with chemical study. After 10,000 years, even this may blend so fully with surrounding layers that it appears no different from the background noise of natural processes. Now extend the timescale to millions of years. Mountains rise and fall. Glaciers scrape the surface clean. Continents shift. At that scale, nearly all human traces are erased. What seemed monumental in one moment becomes invisible in the next. And yet, we should not see this as proof of impossibility. Rather, it reminds us of the extraordinary challenge of looking back. The absence of evidence is not the same as the evidence of absence. The silence of the Earth's surface is not final. It is only the natural consequence of deep time. We may rest here with a gentle conclusion. The scale of energy required to reach space makes such attempts rare and difficult, even for us now. If they occurred long ago, they would likely have been exceptional, not routine. Their traces, fragile and subtle, may have vanished into the vast recycling of Earth. But the possibility, however faint, remains open. And so we hold the thought carefully, like a small flame in the wind, letting it illuminate the edges of our imagination without claiming more than the evidence allows. What if the oceans, covering most of our planet, held within their depths the longest-kept memories of what once was? Let us linger with this thought, for the sea is both a destroyer and a preserver. Waves erase, but they also bury. Salt corrodes, but silt hides. Much of what has ever been built lies near coasts, and coasts are fragile lines, shifting as seas rise and fall. Over long ages, whole landscapes slip beneath the water, their traces sealed away in silence. We may pause to remember the scale. More than 70% of the Earth is hidden beneath the ocean's surface. These depths are dark, cold, and often untouched for millennia. What is lost there may remain undisturbed far longer than on land. Ships that sank only centuries ago are found with timbers still intact, preserved by cold and lack of oxygen. Cities that once stood along ancient shores now rest beneath waves, their outlines softened but still visible to those who look closely. This dual nature of the ocean makes it an unusual archive. It erases through storms, currents, and corrosion, yet it protects by burial in mud, by absence of air, by stillness in deep water. Now let us pause on the mechanisms of this preservation. When something falls into the sea, it may be broken apart by waves. If it settles in shallow water, currents and salt slowly wear it down. But if it sinks deeper, where light does not reach and oxygen is scarce, it can be preserved. Wood survives longer. Metals corrode more slowly. Layers of silt cover and protect. In this way, the ocean floor becomes a hidden library, written not with ink but with sediments that trap and seal. Yet, here too we must recognize limit. The sea is vast, and we have explored only a small fraction of its floor. The depth and pressure make searching difficult. Earthquakes, shifting plates, and volcanic vents also disturb and recycle what lies beneath. What once was buried may be pushed down into the crust, lost to processes far beyond our reach. The silence of the ocean is therefore not simple. It can mean both preservation and erasure. Now we may turn to the language of traces. Marine sediments build up over time, layer upon layer, like pages of a book. Within them lie shells, pollen, and fragments of the past. At times, unusual materials appear, shards of pottery washed out to sea, lumps of metal settled on the bottom, or strange chemical layers marking sudden changes in human activity. Even without intact objects, the sediments themselves may carry signals. Shifts in carbon, spikes in certain isotopes, unexpected concentrations of compound. These are the faint whispers of interaction between human activity and the ocean's patient record. A thought experiment may help us see more clearly. Imagine a settlement on a low coastline. Its people build, work, and leave their traces. Then, as centuries pass, the sea rises, covering the land. At first, structures collapse, their timbers floating away, their metals corroding. But some heavier parts sink, caught in silt. Over thousands of years, waves smooth the shapes, but sediments continue to bury them deeper. After 10,000 years, only fragments remain, locked within mud. After 100,000 years, even those fragments may dissolve, leaving only faint chemical signals. Slightly higher concentrations of certain elements, barely different from surrounding sediment. If we were to study a core drilled from this site, we might find a thin layer that stands out, but without clear context we could not be certain of its origin. It could be human, or it could be natural. This uncertainty is the rhythm we return to. The ocean preserves, but it blurs. It keeps, but it conceals. Its language is quiet, requiring patience to read, and even then it does not speak directly. We may imagine wonders resting beneath the waves, but we must also accept that the sea's archive is selective and often ambiguous. And so we pause at a gentle conclusion. The oceans are keepers of memory, but also editors, choosing what remains and what is erased. Their vastness ensures that much lies hidden, perhaps forever. The absence of discovery does not mean absence of existence. It means only that we have searched little, and the sea keeps its secrets well. In this calm recognition, we may rest with both humility and wonder, knowing that the largest part of our planet is also the most silent archive of all. What if the Earth itself sometimes wipes its own slate clean, leaving behind only fragments of what once was? Let us pause gently with this idea, for the surface of our planet is not fixed but constantly changing. Geological time moves slowly, yet its movements are powerful. Mountains rise, seas retreat, valleys deepen. In these motions, delicate traces of human presence may vanish, hidden beneath new layers or erased altogether. When we speak of geological clocks, we mean the natural record of time written in stone. Each layer of rock is like a page, showing us what the world was like when it formed. Some pages are thick, representing long periods of calm accumulation. Others are thin or missing, signaling interruptions, sudden floods, earthquakes, eruptions. The Earth is both a careful archivist and a ruthless editor, preserving some details while discarding others without hesitation. Now we may linger a little on how these processes work. Over millions of years, continents drift, carried on tectonic plates like rafts on a slow sea. In their motion, they collide, fold, and recycle rock back into the planet's interior. Volcanoes erupt, laying down new surfaces of molten stone. Glaciers grind across landscapes, scraping away entire layers. These events reset the clock, replacing what once was with something new. To us, they feel rare and dramatic, but in the scale of Earth's time they are natural rhythms, repeating endlessly. The limits of our knowledge appear clearly here. We can read only what remains. Where the layers are gone, we cannot see what they once contained. It is as if we hold a book with many pages missing. We cannot assume the missing chapters were empty. We can only accept that we no longer know their content. This is why silence in the record cannot be taken as proof of absence. It is simply silence. The language of traces, however, still speaks. Even when layers are disrupted, hints sometimes survive. A thin deposit of volcanic ash tells of distant fire. A sudden spike in rare elements hints at a meteor impact. A subtle shift in isotopes within sediments reveals changes in climate. These are not full stories but fragments, scattered notes that suggest larger event. If human activity once reached unusual heights, such as the creation of intense heat or the use of rare materials, it might have left signals like these. They would not be clear statements but quiet anomalies, points where the natural rhythm seems to pause or shift. Let us take a thought experiment to see this more clearly. Imagine a land where a group of people built structures and machines. They lived, worked, and left traces of fire and metal. For a time, their marks were visible. Then came a volcanic eruption. Lava flowed, burying the site. Ash rained down, covering everything. For centuries, the traces remained sealed. But over thousands of years, the ground shifted, rivers cut new paths, and glaciers scraped the land. After millions of years, the buried site was drawn deep into the earth, melted, and remade into new stone. At the surface, no sign remained. Only perhaps a thin, unusual layer of ash, or a faint chemical anomaly, might hint at what was lost. Now extend the experiment further. Imagine several cycles of such resets, mountains rising, oceans advancing, glaciers carving. Each time, more of the past is erased. After many cycles, what survives is not the detail, but only the broad rhythm. Fire, flood, ice, impact. Within such rhythms, small human traces may vanish entirely, folded into the larger story of the planet. And yet, not everything is erased. Some fossils endure, fragile but stubborn. Some chemical layers persist, trapped in stone. Even within resets, the earth sometimes preserves whispers. These whispers remind us that while much is lost, not all is gone. We can still listen, though the language is broken. And so we reach a quiet understanding. Geological clocks tell us both of time's patience and of its power. They show us how easily records can be erased, but also how fragments endure. This dual nature invites humility. What we do not find is not proof of absence. What we do find is not the whole story. Between them lies a gentle balance, a reminder that the earth keeps its secrets with care, offering us glimpses but never the full book. We rest here, with the sense that deep time is both archive and eraser, preserving some traces while sweeping countless others away into silence. What if the most enduring signs of earlier ages are not machines or metals, but stone itself, shaped and lifted in ways that still puzzle us? Let us pause with this idea, for across the world we see monuments of stone, vast and silent, that have survived long after their makers have gone. Pyramids, megaliths, temples carved into cliffs. These structures remain like anchors in the flow of time, resisting the decay that claims wood, fabric, and even metals. They are not eternal, but their endurance stretches across thousands of years, far beyond the lifespan of most human works. When we look at such monuments, we may imagine them as the bones of civilizations, the parts most resistant to weather and forgetting. Stone, once shaped, weathers slowly. A block of granite may take tens of thousands of years to soften, millions to vanish entirely. This slowness gives us the chance to glimpse what otherwise would be lost. The scale is important. Human memory rarely extends beyond a few generations, yet these monuments bridge across dozens, even hundreds of generations, standing while languages shift, while cultures rise and fall. Their survival teaches us that in the rhythm of decay, some things move more slowly, leaving traces for us to read. Now let us pause on the mechanisms of endurance. Stone is hard, dense, and resistant to ordinary weather. A pyramid's mass, spread across immense foundations, makes it difficult for erosion to erase quickly. A temple carved into rock remains sheltered, even as winds blow outside. But this endurance is not invulnerability. Earthquakes topple, floods undermine, and over time, even the hardest stone returns to dust. Endurance is only a matter of pace, not permanence. Still, it gives us a window, a chance to see into ages that would otherwise be blank. Here we must recognize the limits of interpretation. Stone alone does not tell us everything. A pyramid can endure, but the knowledge of how it was built may vanish. A temple may remain, but the meanings of its carvings may be forgotten. We can measure, we can compare, we can test the age of the stone itself, yet the full context often escapes us. The monument becomes a silent survivor, its voice faint, open to many readings. Now let us think of the language of traces that such works leave. Their very size is a signal. A massive block transported far from its source tells us of knowledge of movement, of cooperation, of engineering. Carvings in stone may show tools or symbols, revealing cultural patterns. The alignment of monuments with the stars may suggest awareness of cycles in the heavens. These are indirect markers, not records in words but in forms and choices. They show us that those who built them had patience, organization, and intention. If we imagine further, we may ask softly whether such builders might also have reached higher than stone, perhaps into other crafts now lost. Let us take a thought experiment. Imagine a culture that masters many skills, including both the shaping of stone and more fragile technologies. Their great stone works endure, but their metals corrode, their writings decay, their machines fall to dust. After thousands of years, what remains visible are the stone monuments, standing as the clearest signals of their presence. To us, looking back, it may seem that stone was their highest achievement, because it is the only one that survived. But in truth, other skills may have been present, only less resistant to time. Extend the thought further. Imagine another 10,000 years. Even the stone softens. A pyramid becomes a mound. A carved temple becomes a cliff face with faint marks. After hundreds of thousands of years, even these survivors may be gone, ground down by ice or buried under new layers. The record of stone, long-lasting as it is still temporary. Its endurance simply gives us more time to notice. From this we draw a gentle conclusion. Stone is a keeper of memory, more patient than wood, more enduring than metal, yet still subject to time. Its monuments show us that traces of human ambition can last far beyond a single culture, but not forever. What we see today are the lucky survivors, the fragments that endured. Their silence leaves room for imagination, but also demands humility. The presence of enduring stone shows us something of the past, but the absence of other traces cannot prove what was or was not achieved. And so we rest with the thought that the longevity of stone is both gift and limit. It reminds us that some echoes of earlier ages may last long enough to reach us, while countless others have already faded into silence, leaving only questions and the soft rhythm of possibility. What if the metals of the earth themselves carried whispers of what once was, faint signals preserved in their very atoms? Let us move softly into this thought, for metals are both fragile and enduring. They corrode, they rust, they vanish into soil. Yet at the same time, their composition can carry a kind of memory. The balance of isotopes, the presence of unusual alloys, the traces of refining, these can tell us whether a piece of matter was shaped by nature or by human hands. We live in a world where metals are all around us. Iron, copper, gold, aluminum, each drawn from stone, each refined, each shaped into tools. To refine metal means to separate it from ore, to change it through fire and chemistry. This process leaves behind fingerprints. Slag, the waste from smelting, is one such marker. It is glassy, brittle, and unlike anything nature creates on its own. If we find slag in a layer of soil, we know it marks the presence of human activity. Now we pause for a moment on scale. The isotopes within metals are like different flavors of the same element. They behave almost the same, but not entirely. Processes of smelting and refining can shift these balances slightly, leaving behind a signal that tells us something was altered. In this way, even if the object itself is gone, the soil or rock around it may still carry memory. But here we meet the limits of what can be known. Over thousands of years, metals return to the earth. Iron turns to rust and becomes indistinguishable from natural oxides. Bronze and copper grow green, then crumble. Even gold, though slow to change, can be scattered into dust. What remains after long spans may be only the faintest hint in the chemistry of a layer, a trace hard to separate from natural background. The absence of clear metallic artifacts does not mean they never existed. It may only mean they were too fragile to endure. Now let us think of the language of metals as a subtle archive. Archaeologists often find not the tools themselves but their residues, microscopic particles of lead in soil, traces of copper in a riverbed, unexpected levels of tin in sediment. These quiet signals point to human refining and working. They do not give us full stories, but they show us where human fire once burned. If, in some forgotten age, metals were shaped in ways now unknown, their traces might still be detectable in unusual concentrations or patterns, waiting to be read. A thought experiment may help us here. Imagine a community that learns to refine metals in unusual ways, perhaps making alloys with properties we do not expect. For a time, they build, they shape, they create. Then the community fades. Their tools corrode, their machines break, their knowledge is lost. After 1,000 years, only fragments remain, buried and rusting. After 10,000 years, even those fragments are gone. But in the soil, there is a slight enrichment of certain elements, a pattern not quite natural. After 100,000 years, the land has shifted, but perhaps in one layer of clay or sediment the anomaly remains. To us, looking back, it would be only a faint chemical signal, easy to overlook, easy to dismiss as chance. Yet it would still be a trace, a whisper of what once was. If we stretch this thought further, to millions of years, we see how fragile such whispers are. Tectonic motion recycles crust, heat melts and remakes stone, oceans wash away patterns. But sometimes, just sometimes, signals endure. A pocket of slag preserved in a cave. A vein of soil enriched in unusual isotope. A thin layer in a lake bed, carrying tiny metallic particles. These are not monuments, not machines, but they are evidence of process, and they remind us that the earth itself can hold memory in matter. We may now rest with a gentle conclusion. The language of metals is subtle, but it is real. It tells us of fire, of refining, of human touch. It can persist as chemical shadow long after the objects themselves are gone. Yet it is fragile, easily erased by time and chance. The silence of the record does not prove nothing was ever shaped. It proves only that metals, like all things, obey the long patience of the earth. What remains is possibility, quiet and unresolved, an open space where imagination and evidence meet without haste. What if the past could sometimes be traced not through objects but through patterns, numbers, and quiet irregularities that show themselves when we look across long spans of time? Let us linger here, for statistics and data can form their own kind of archive. They do not give us stories in words, but they reveal rhythms, rises, and sudden falls that invite reflection. When we study the long history of life and climate, we often find changes recorded not in monuments but in curves and graphs. Populations grow, then shrink. Forests spread, then retreat. Oceans rise and fall. Each of these patterns can be seen in data drawn from pollen grains, ice layers, or sediment. Sometimes the lines run smooth, shaped by natural cycles. Sometimes, however, the lines stutter, showing abrupt changes. In these interruptions, we glimpse events, volcanic eruptions, impacts from the sky, or perhaps human activity. Now let us pause gently on how such signals form. Imagine a forest. Each year, trees shed pollen, which falls into a lake. Layer by layer, these grains build a record at the bottom, forming a quiet logbook of what grew nearby. Centuries later, we can study the sediments and see when forests thrived and when they disappeared. In the same way, ice holds bubbles of air, showing us how much carbon or methane once filled the atmosphere. These are natural recorders, slow and impartial, offering patterns to those who learn to read them. But here we meet the limits of our sight. When we see a sudden dip in population data, or a spike in unusual elements, we cannot always know why. Was it climate, disease, disaster, or something else entirely? Our interpretations remain cautious. Numbers are clues, not conclusions. A quiet shift in a graph may point to extraordinary events, but without direct artifacts we cannot be certain. We must hold such signs gently, knowing they are suggestions rather than proofs. Now let us consider the language of these statistical traces. A sharp decline in pollen diversity may show that forests vanished suddenly. A spike in soot in ice layers can tell of widespread burning. An unusual rise in certain metals within sediments may suggest smelting or other industrial activity. Each marker is small, yet together they can paint a picture of disturbance or change. If human actions once reached great intensity, even long ago, such markers might remain, hidden in graphs and charts rather than in visible ruins. Let us take a thought experiment to see how this might unfold. Imagine a civilization grows, builds, and consumes. For a time, its forests thin, its fires release soot, its smelting adds metals to rivers. In its own age, these are daily acts, unnoticed beyond their immediate effect. Centuries later, the civilization fades, its works crumble, its people scatter. On the surface, little remains. But in the sediments, a thin line of soot endures. In the ice, a brief spike of carbon dioxide lingers. In the soil, a pocket of altered chemistry rests. Thousands of years pass. The line, the spike, the pocket are still there, faint but detectable. To those who later study them, they appear as anomalies, brief signals of unusual intensity. Without context, we might never know their full story, but the signals remain nonetheless. If we stretch this further, to tens of thousands of years, the lines blur. Sediments mix, ice melts, patterns smooth. Yet sometimes, even then, traces persist. Like the faint rings of a tree showing a year of drought, the earth keeps records of disruptions, even when the details are lost. From this reflection we may draw a quiet conclusion. Statistics and patterns are not proof of forgotten achievements, but they remind us that events leave echoes in data. These echoes do not fade as quickly as objects, for they are stored in the chemistry of air, water, and soil. They are fragile, but they can endure long enough for us to notice. Their silence is not emptiness. It is a soft murmur, asking us to look with patience and humility. And so we rest here, with the awareness that sometimes the past speaks, not in stones or artifacts, but in the gentle rise and fall of lines across time, numbers carrying whispers of what once might have been. What if we turned the gaze not to distant ages but to ourselves, asking what remains of our world if time were stretched far beyond our lives? Let us move softly into this reflection, for by imagining our own traces we can better sense how fragile or enduring the past may be. Picture our cities, bright with towers of steel and glass. Picture our machines, our satellites, our vast roads and bridges. They seem strong, fixed, permanent. Yet if we pause and extend time, we see how quickly they change. Without care, steel rusts, concrete cracks, glass falls. Within only a few centuries, buildings collapse, their frames reduce to rubble. After 1,000 years, much of what we call modern might already be unrecognizable, overgrown with plants, scattered by storms, swallowed by soil. Now let us linger on the scale of this decay. Cars and airplanes, left without use, would vanish in centuries. Plastics may remain longer, though even they break down into fragments carried by rivers and seas. Satellites in orbit, circling above us now, would slowly lose height. Some would fall within decades, others within centuries, burning in the atmosphere. After a few thousand years, almost all would be gone. The sky that once held their glitter would be clear again. Only a few traces, perhaps on the moon or in deep space, might endure. Now we pause on what we do not know. We cannot be certain how long every material will last. Some plastics may remain for millions of years, but only as scattered particles. Some metals may leave faint signals in soils. Yet most of the complex structures, the shapes that carry meaning, will vanish long before. This is the quiet reminder that even what seems indestructible is temporary when measured against the Earth's time. Let us think of the language of traces our world might leave. Chemical layers enriched with carbon from our burning fuels. Sediments holding fragments of plastic, small and scattered. Soil carrying unusual levels of nitrogen from fertilizers. Ice recording the gases we release into the air. These are not monuments, but they are signals, statistical markers, chemical fingerprints, the quiet record of our presence. Even if our cities and machines were gone, the Earth would remember us in these altered layers. A thought experiment may help us see more clearly. Imagine that humanity disappears tomorrow. At first, the silence spreads through empty streets. 100 years later, forests grow over highways, animals nest in buildings. 1,000 years later, bridges fall, dams crumble, and rivers take new courses. 10,000 years later, glaciers may advance again, scraping away what remains. Yet in sediments of lakes, there is a thin band rich in plastic and soot. In ice layers, a spike of carbon dioxide. In soil, chemical traces of farming. To anyone looking back, these lines would be visible, though faint. They would show that something unusual once happened here. Stretch the experiment further. Imagine 1,000,000 years. Continents shift. Mountains rise. Oceans claim land. Almost no trace of our structures survives at the surface. Yet in deep layers, the anomalies remain. A sudden enrichment of metals, a sharp change in carbon isotopes, fragments of strange compounds. To a future observer, these might appear as a brief geological event, an odd pulse in the record, distinct from what came before and after. Was it natural, or was it something else? The answer would not be certain. Only the faint signal would endure. From this we may rest with a gentle understanding. By imagining the fragility of our own traces, we learn to see why the past may be silent. If others had reached heights before us, their works too may have faded, leaving only faint marks, indistinguishable from natural rhythms. The absence of visible remains does not prove absence of achievement. It proves only that time is patient, and matter obeys its own rules. We close softly here, with the thought that our own future record will likely be thin, a brief signal in stone and ice. And just as we may wonder about forgotten ages, others might one day wonder about us, reading only the faint lines we leave behind, open to interpretation, resting quietly in the great archive of the earth. What if some traces are not buried in stone or sealed in ice, but scattered far above us, among the stars, where time moves differently? Let us rest gently with this idea, for space itself can be both harsh and strangely protective. On Earth, winds, water, and shifting ground erase. In orbit and beyond, there is no rain, no soil, no tide. Objects can remain for centuries, even millennia, circling in silence. And yet, space is not entirely safe. Micrometeoroids strike with quiet violence. Radiation weakens materials. Gravity slowly pulls satellites downward, where they burn into fire on re-entry. Still, there are places where traces could endure far longer. The moon is one such archive. Without air, without weather, without flowing water, its surface changes only slowly, shaped mainly by impacts from space. A footprint pressed into lunar dust can last millions of years, unless another impact covers it. Now let us pause and imagine the mechanism. When an object rests on the moon, it is not washed away, not rusted, not dissolved. Its decay is measured not in centuries, but in vast spans. A fragment of metal, a shard of glass, or even a landing site could remain visible far into the future. If any earlier attempt to leave Earth had touched the moon, its traces might still be there, hidden in craters, faint and silent. Beyond the moon, the story grows more subtle. In the vastness of deep space, objects drift without much change. A probe sent outward might circle the sun for millions of years, disturbed only by chance encounters. But here we meet the limits of probability. Space is immense, and the chances of ever finding such fragments are slim. The silence of the sky is not proof of absence. It is only a reflection of its vastness. Now we may pause on the language of traces in near space. Radar today can track thousands of pieces of debris in orbit, remnants of rockets, satellites, and tests. They form a cloud around Earth, a quiet signal of our age. In centuries, most of these will fall, burning into dust. But in the meantime, they are unmistakable markers of our reach. If others had placed machines in orbit long ago, they too would have circled for a time. They too would eventually have decayed. Unless, perhaps, some small fragments endured longer, waiting quietly until they too were drawn down. A thought experiment may help us follow this further. Imagine a civilization launches a small craft, placing it in high orbit. At first, it circles steadily. After centuries, the orbit decays slowly. Thousands of years later, it begins to fall, until at last it meets the air and burns away. What remains is not the craft itself, but perhaps thin traces, particles scattered into upper layers of the atmosphere, subtle chemical signals that fall with time into snow or ice. To anyone looking much later, the object itself is gone. Only the faintest anomalies remain, hidden in layers of sediment. Now extend this thought to the moon. Imagine a lander touching down, leaving behind a small mark. No weather erases it. No river carries it away. It remains, covered slowly by dust, but still present. Millions of years later, the mark is faint but real. Unlike Earth, where traces vanish quickly, the moon offers stillness, a kind of frozen memory. And yet, we cannot be certain. Impacts may bury or destroy. Dust may settle endlessly. What survives and what is lost is beyond our full knowing. We may rest with this balance. Space offers both preservation and erasure. Its silence is protective, but also vast, making traces rare and hard to find. If any earlier age had reached outward, its signs might still drift, or rest on the moon, or lie scattered beyond. Or they may already be gone, erased by impacts or drawn back into Earth's air. We cannot say with certainty. We can only acknowledge possibility. And so we close softly, with the thought that space is not empty but a patient archive, holding traces both fragile and enduring. It reminds us that silence does not mean nothing has happened. It means only that time and distance make memory delicate. A whisper spread across the dark. What if not only matter, but the very patterns of the sky could act as carriers of memory, hinting at events long gone? Let us rest for a while with this possibility, for stars and planets move in ways that are predictable, and when humans have observed them, they often left records, whether carved into stone or woven into story. Celestial cycles are stable across ages, and so when we find old alignments on Earth, temples pointing to solstices, stones marking lunar paths, they act as faint bridges between us and those who watched before. Now let us gently pause on the scale of these rhythms. The sun rises and sets each day, yet its position on the horizon shifts slowly with the seasons. The moon repeats its cycle, but with subtle variations over many years. The stars drift too, though so slowly that only across centuries does their shift become noticeable. To those who build carefully, marking alignments with the heavens, these changes can leave behind clues that later generations can still read. A structure facing sunrise on the solstice thousands of years ago will not point to the same place now. This drift, called precession, is like the slow wobble of a spinning top. It allows us to measure the age of ancient alignments, to see when they were first observed. In this way, the sky itself becomes a quiet clock, against which human activity can be traced. Yet here too we must acknowledge limit. An alignment may be intentional, but it may also be chance. A temple may face the sun, or it may simply follow the slope of a hill. Without context we cannot be certain. The language of celestial traces is suggestive, not decisive. It invites careful reading, but never grants full certainty. Now let us think of the signals themselves. Across the world, monuments align with stars and solstices. Stone circles in northern lands, pyramids near deserts, observatories carved in mountains, all show awareness of the sky. These are not proof of forgotten technologies, but they reveal something enduring, a long human fascination with the heavens, a need to measure time, to mark cycles, to understand patterns. If ever people had reached further, into flight or beyond, we might expect echoes of that interest preserved in these alignments. Even if machines have vanished, the care with which the sky was studied might remain. Let us take a thought experiment. Imagine a community watching the skies with both wonder and purpose. They learn the cycles, build structures to mark them, and perhaps go further, using the knowledge to guide journeys or even attempts to ascend. Their machines are fragile, their tools soon lost, but their monuments of stone endure, pointing toward stars that no longer rise in the same place. Thousands of years later, we see the alignments, and they whisper of an attention to the sky deeper than survival alone required. Now stretch the experiment further. Imagine not one community, but many, across continents, each leaving behind its own markers, stones, carvings, alignment. With time, all machines vanish, all metals corrode. But the alignments, carved into landscape, remain faintly visible. To us, they suggest not proof, but a pattern, that long before, people cared for the heavens in ways that seem almost scientific. From this we draw a quiet understanding. Celestial patterns are among the most enduring archives, for the sky itself provides the framework. By reading the alignments of monuments, we catch glimpses of past awareness, though never the full story. They show us that humanity has always looked upward, always wondered, always measured. Whether that wonder led to forgotten attempts at reaching higher, we cannot know. But the traces remind us that the sky has always been a part of our memory, both as guide and as archive. And so we pause, with the sense that the heavens are not only a place of possibility but also of record, keeping time with patience far beyond our own lives. In their silence, they invite us to listen, without hurry, to the long rhythm of both nature and memory. What if the most enduring archives are not carved in stone or sealed in ice, but carried in stories, repeated across generations until they become woven into the fabric of culture itself? Let us linger gently with this thought, for oral traditions are both fragile and persistent. They change with every telling, yet they can travel across centuries, carrying fragments of memory long after objects and buildings have gone. In this way, words and rhythms can serve as vessels, lighter than clay yet able to outlast whole monuments. When we speak of oral traditions, we mean songs, myths, chants, and rituals that are passed down without writing. Each telling is like a weaving of threads. Some are kept, others are dropped, new ones are added. Over time, the pattern shifts, but certain shapes remain. A motif of fire, of flight, of descent from the heavens, may appear again and again, even as details shift. In this persistence lies the possibility of deep memory. Now let us pause on the mechanisms of survival. Oral traditions are often tied to ritual, to seasonal cycles, to the rhythms of life. A story told at harvest, or at the turning of the year, has a place in the cycle and so is repeated. Its details may change, but the core remains. Through this repetition, memory stretches across generations. Even when writing fades, even when libraries burn, stories continue, carried by the voice. Yet here we must recognize the limit. Stories are not static records. They do not preserve precise detail. A description of a journey into the sky may begin as memory, but over centuries it becomes wrapped in symbols: chariots of fire, stairways of light, birds of metal. To us, looking back, it is impossible to separate invention from memory with certainty. The absence of clarity does not mean absence of origin, it only means that time has blurred the lines. Let us consider the language of these traces. Across many cultures, myths of ascent recur. Heroes rising to the heavens, gods descending from the stars, beings of light traveling between worlds. These motifs are not evidence of spaceflight, but they are signals of human imagination directed upward, a pattern that repeats widely. Their very recurrence is a kind of marker, showing us that the idea of leaving Earth has lived in human thought for longer than we can measure. Now let us take a thought experiment. Imagine a small event long ago, perhaps an unusual sight in the sky, or even an attempt at flight that startled those who watched. At first, the memory is strong, told as it was seen. Generations pass, and the story is retold with additions, with symbols, with layers of meaning. After centuries, it is no longer a report, but a myth. After millennia, it is a sacred story woven into ritual. To us, arriving late, it is impossible to know whether the origin was pure imagination, a rare natural event, or even a forgotten attempt. Yet the pattern remains, whispering of something that mattered enough to be told again and again. Stretch the experiment further. Imagine not one story, but many, scattered across lands, each carrying fragments. Some tell of fiery chariots, others of beings descending, others of stairways to the stars. Each story is different, yet all share a motif of crossing the boundary between earth and sky. To us, this shared pattern could be coincidence, a reflection of the universal human desire to transcend. Or it could be a faint echo of experiences long forgotten, diffused and reshaped until only symbols remain. We cannot decide with certainty. We can only note the persistence and hold it gently as possibility. From this reflection we may rest with a quiet conclusion. Oral traditions are not proof, but they are not empty either. They show us what captured human attention, what was repeated enough to endure. They are fragile archives, vulnerable to change, yet sometimes they carry signals far beyond their original moment. In their rhythms, we hear the long continuity of imagination, and perhaps, at times, faint traces of memory. We close softly here, aware that stories are both mirrors and echoes. They may reflect only dreams, or they may carry whispers of events now hidden by time. Either way, they remind us that the human voice itself is one of the oldest vessels of memory, carrying fragments across centuries like seeds on the wind. What if the traces of earlier journeys to the sky are not to be found in artifacts or ruins, but in the language of disappearance itself, moments when whole chapters of history seem to have been torn from the record? Let us settle into this reflection, for history is not continuous. It comes to us in fragments, stitched together from what survives. Between the fragments lie silences, gaps where events once unfolded but left no clear imprint. These silences may be natural, the result of time's patience, but they may also conceal forgotten attempts, ventures that once stirred the earth but later faded into nothingness. When we speak of lost civilizations, we mean cultures that once flourished, leaving evidence of their presence, yet then vanished. Some left great monuments, others only faint traces. The Maya, the Indus Valley peoples, the builders of ancient Anatolia, all rose, thrived, and then declined, leaving questions alongside their ruins. In each case, we see how knowledge, skill, and memory can vanish within only a few centuries. And if that is possible in times we can still trace, what of deeper ages, where the gaps stretch further than we can imagine? Now let us pause on the mechanisms of forgetting. Collapse can come from climate shifts, from drought, from famine, from war, from disease. It can also come from slow erosion of social bonds, when trade routes break and communities scatter. When this happens, technologies are often the first to vanish. A complex craft, once common, may disappear if no one remains to teach it. After a few generations, it is gone, as if it had never existed. The record is fragile, because it depends on memory, on continuity, on survival. Yet here we meet the limits of our knowing. We can study ruins, we can study layers of soil, we can read ancient texts when they remain. But we cannot fully know what was lost when silence falls. We see only what endured. This is why we must hold space for possibility. Absence of evidence is not proof of absence. It is only the echo of forgetting. Let us think of the language of these silences. In the Indus Valley, great cities were built with careful planning, yet their script remains unread. We know they had writing, but we cannot hear their voices. In Central America, the Maya built observatories, charted stars, and wrote records. Many of their texts were destroyed, leaving only fragments. In the Andes, great road systems and structures endure, yet much of the culture that made them is silent to us now. These silences are not proof of extraordinary achievements, but they remind us that forgetting is natural. What we know is always less than what once was. Now let us take a thought experiment. Imagine a culture that reached far, perhaps further than we expect. For a time, its work stood clear: machines, towers, attempts at flight. Then came a collapse. Within a century, the works were abandoned. Metals corroded, wood rotted, fabrics crumbled. After a few more centuries, plants covered the sites, rivers shifted, stone broke. 1,000 years later, what remained was faint: shards, dust, fragments without context. After 10,000 years, even these were gone. Only the silence remained, a gap in the record where something once stood. To later eyes, there would be no proof, only questions. Stretch the experiment further. Imagine millions of years. Continents drift, ice sheets scrape the land, mountains rise and fall. Whatever traces once existed are gone entirely, folded back into the Earth's crust. To us, there would be no hint at all, only the silence, only the absence. And yet, the possibility would remain open, simply because the record is incomplete by nature. From this reflection we may rest with a gentle conclusion. Disappearances in history remind us that knowledge is fragile, that civilizations can fall and leave only silence behind. They also remind us that our record of the past is partial, stitched together from fragments, always surrounded by gaps. Into these gaps, questions arise. Were they empty, or were they full of forgotten attempts? We cannot say. What we can do is acknowledge the fragility of memory and the patience of time, knowing that the silences are as much a part of history as the fragments that endure. And in those silences, the possibility of the extraordinary quietly lingers. What if traces of forgotten attempts are not only physical, not only carved into stone or hidden in soil, but carried in the quiet language of symbols, repeated across cultures and times? Let us linger on this idea, for symbols are resilient in their own way. They shift in meaning, they take on new layers, but often they endure longer than words. A spiral carved on a rock, a star painted in a cave, a winged figure etched into clay, these are not machines, yet they may carry echoes of how people once imagined, once remembered, once dreamed. Symbols are like vessels that change their contents as they pass from hand to hand. A shape that once meant one thing can, centuries later, mean something else entirely. But the persistence of the shape tells us it carried weight. The circle, for example, is found almost everywhere. It can mean the sun, the moon, the cycle of time, or the eye of heaven. The meaning shifts, but the form endures. In that endurance lies the possibility of long memory, blurred but not erased. Now let us pause gently on the mechanisms of how symbols travel. Unlike precise technical instructions, symbols can be remembered without detail. A child learns to draw a shape without knowing its origin. A ritual repeats a gesture without understanding its first meaning. Through such repetition, fragments can cross centuries and even millennia. Their original purpose may be lost, yet their presence tells us that something once mattered deeply enough to be carried forward. Yet here we must recognize the limit. Symbols are not direct evidence. A spiral may recall a galaxy, or it may recall a shell. A winged figure may describe flight, or it may describe spirit. We cannot know with certainty what was intended. We can only observe the persistence and note that certain motifs return again and again. The absence of clarity does not erase the possibility that memory of unusual events may linger in symbolic form. Now let us think of the language of such traces. Across many cultures, symbols of ascent appear: ladders, stairways, birds, and chariots of fire. Across others, symbols of descent: gifts from the sky, beings of light, knowledge from above. These do not prove forgotten journeys, but they form patterns that suggest a long preoccupation with the boundary between earth and sky. The patterns are the markers, recurrent, enduring, resilient even when detail is lost. A thought experiment may help us here. Imagine a community witnesses something unusual, perhaps a great light, or even a rare attempt at flight. At first, they describe it plainly. Generations pass, and the description becomes a ritual, a story, a carved image. The image endures, repeated in clay, in stone, in textiles. After centuries, the memory of the event itself fades, but the image remains, now woven into religion or myth. Thousands of years later, we find the image, and it seems only symbolic. Yet perhaps, far in its past, it was also a memory. Extend this further. Imagine such fragments scattered across cultures, each carrying its own version of a symbol. One people speaks of stairways of fire, another of boats of the heavens, another of birds that carry souls upward. Each symbol is different, but together they form a constellation, a pattern of motifs pointing to the sky. To us, this may be coincidence, or it may be reflection of a universal human desire. But it might also carry echoes of experiences so old they no longer survive in direct form. We cannot know. We can only hold the pattern gently, acknowledging its persistence. And so we may rest with a quiet conclusion. Symbols are not evidence in the strict sense, but they are not empty either. They show us what endured, what people thought important enough to carve, to repeat, to carry forward. Their persistence across time and space suggests a deep continuity of imagination and perhaps, at times, faint memory. They remind us that even when words and objects are gone, forms and motifs may remain, like shadows of thoughts cast across generations. In their silence, they invite us not to decide, but to listen, to accept that possibility lingers in patterns as much as in ruins. And so we pause, aware that symbols are themselves a kind of trace, ambiguous, enduring, and quietly suggestive of paths we may never fully see. What if languages themselves carried hidden fragments of memory, faint echoes of things seen or imagined long before writing? Let us rest with this idea, for words are more fragile than stone, yet sometimes they endure in surprising ways. A root word, passed down through centuries, can travel across cultures, shifting in sound but still holding part of its old meaning. In this way, speech itself becomes a quiet archive, one that is less visible than monuments but no less important for understanding the persistence of thought. Now we may pause gently on the scale of this endurance. Languages grow, change, and vanish, but their roots often survive in new tongues. A word for sky in one language may resemble a word for heaven in another, separated by thousands of years but still linked. Patterns of meaning travel too, metaphors of ascent, of fire, of flight. They are not proof of events, but they show us the persistence of certain ideas, carried forward by language even when cultures fade. The mechanisms of this survival are simple but powerful. Children learn words from parents. Generations pass them along, adjusting pronunciation, altering meaning, but keeping something of the original alive. Over centuries, the origins may be forgotten, but the word still exists, carrying a shadow of its past. Linguists call this etymology, the tracing of root. It is like following the branching of a tree back toward its trunk, always with the awareness that some branches have broken, leaving gaps. Yet here we meet the limits of our knowledge. A word may resemble another by coincidence. Two cultures may share similar metaphors without direct connection. When we see the same motif, of ascent to the sky, of fiery travel, of celestial beings, in distant tongues, we cannot be certain whether it is shared memory or simply the common reach of human imagination. The language of traces in words is suggestive, not definitive. Still, patterns emerge. Across many traditions, words for spirit are tied to breath or wind. Words for gods are tied to the sky or the stars. Words for fire appear in stories of knowledge, of power, of transformation. These patterns are indirect signals, showing us where human thought often turned. If in some forgotten age people truly attempted to ascend, the echo of that attempt might be hidden in the metaphors that survived, though never as clear testimony. Now let us take a thought experiment. Imagine a people who once built something unusual, perhaps even machines that rose into the air. For a time, they used precise words to describe them. But when the machines were gone and the knowledge faded, the words did not vanish immediately. They shifted. A word that once meant vessel of fire became a word for chariot of gods. A word that once meant engine of ascent became a word for stairway to heaven. Centuries later, the machines are forgotten, but the words remain, reshaped into myth, still pointing upward. Extend this further. Imagine other peoples encountering the words, borrowing them, folding them into their own languages. Over millennia, the original meaning is buried deeper and deeper, until only faint similarities remain. To us, they seem like metaphors, but perhaps beneath the metaphors there is a faint echo of memory, impossible to prove but not easy to dismiss. From this reflection we may pause with a gentle understanding. Language is one of the most fragile of archives, yet also one of the most enduring in hidden ways. It changes constantly, yet it carries patterns across ages. Its silences are as important as its words. When we read myths and listen to old phrases, we are hearing not direct evidence, but the long rhythm of memory, blurred by time. The absence of clear testimony does not mean the absence of origin. It means only that words, like all things, drift and change. And so we may rest with this thought, that within the soft fabric of language, there may linger shadows of experiences older than we can trace. Not proof, not certainty, but whispers woven into the very way humans speak of sky, of fire, of ascent. They remind us that memory can travel not only through stone or story, but through syllables, fragile yet enduring, carried on the breath across generations. What if the true archive of forgotten ages is written not in stone, nor in words, but in the very layers of ice and soil, where air, water, and dust are quietly stored? Let us stay with this thought, for the earth itself holds records far older than any library. When snow falls, it traps tiny bubbles of atmosphere, tiny grains of ash, tiny fragments of life. Layer upon layer, year after year, these traces are pressed into ice, forming a frozen timeline. When we drill into glaciers and read the cores, we are holding the breath of ages past. The same is true of soils and sediments. Rivers carry pollen, dust, and minerals into lakes, where they settle in thin layers. Each layer is like a page, holding clues to the climate, to the vegetation, even to the fires that once burned. Over millennia, these pages stack into books of mud and stone, books that can be read if we know how to listen. Now let us pause gently on how this process works. Ice cores preserve gases, telling us how much carbon dioxide or methane filled the air. They also preserve ash from volcanic eruptions, and traces of soot from fires. Lake sediments preserve pollen, showing which plants grew, and sometimes they hold metals carried by rivers. These are not direct records of human activity, but they are signals. A sudden rise in soot may mean forests burned. A spike in metals may mean smelting. A change in isotopes may mean large-scale alteration of land. The earth records these changes without judgment, quietly and patiently. Yet here we meet the limits of knowledge. Many natural processes can create similar signals. Volcanoes release metals, just as smelting does. Wildfires release soot, just as human burning does. Changes in pollen may reflect climate shifts rather than farming. When we see anomalies in the record, we cannot always separate natural from human causes. The archive speaks, but not in clear words. We must interpret carefully, knowing that absence of certainty does not mean absence of possibility. Now let us reflect on the language of these traces. In Greenland and Antarctica, ice cores show unusual rises in lead during Roman times, when smelting was widespread. In sediments of lakes, we see sudden increases in charcoal, marking ages of fire. In peat bogs, we find traces of heavy metals far older than industrial times, suggesting earlier experiments with fire and ore. These are faint but real markers, indirect signatures of human presence. If there were forgotten ages of greater skill, their signals might appear in the same way. Anomalies in chemistry, spikes in soot, sudden shifts in isotopes. Let us take a thought experiment. Imagine a culture that used fire and metal on a scale larger than expected. Their activity releases gases, soot, and waste into the air and rivers. For a time, the changes are strong, reshaping the chemistry of the environment. Then the culture fades. Buildings vanish, tools corrode, words are forgotten. Yet in ice, in soil, in sediment, the signal remains. A spike of carbon, a layer of soot, an enrichment of metals. Thousands of years later, these signals are still there, faint but detectable. To us, they would appear as anomalies, brief signals of unusual activity, difficult to explain fully. Extend this further. Imagine 1,000,000 years of shifting climates, of ice advancing and retreating, of mountains rising and rivers cutting new paths. Many records are erased, but some remain, preserved in places undisturbed. A single layer of ash, a sudden anomaly in isotopes, a pocket of soil enriched with strange compounds. To us, these fragments would be difficult to read. Were they natural? Were they human? We could not know with certainty. But they would still be traces, whispers of a moment when something unusual happened. From this reflection we may rest with a gentle conclusion. Ice, soil, and sediments are among the most patient archives of Earth. They preserve signals long after objects are gone. They remind us that human presence leaves not only monuments, but chemistry, imprinted quietly into the layers of the planet. These signals are not decisive, but they are enduring. They invite us to listen with humility, to recognize that what we see is partial, and what we cannot see may be vast. The absence of proof is not proof of absence. It is only the silence of records not yet found, or signals too faint to be certain. And so we pause, aware that the earth itself is always writing, quietly and without haste, leaving pages that future eyes may read, if they choose to listen softly enough. What if the oceans themselves carry quiet archives of forgotten moments, not in carved symbols or standing ruins, but in layers of sediment stretched across their vast floors? Let us move gently into this idea, for the sea covers most of our planet, hiding beneath it records as old as the continent. Each river that flows into the sea carries with it soil, pollen, ash, and fragments of human and natural activity. These settle slowly on the seabed, pressed layer upon layer, creating a long memory written in mud. When scientists draw up cores from the ocean floor, they are in a sense opening a book, each page 1,000 years or more, filled not with words but with grains, isotopes, and fossils. The process is slow but steady. Dust from deserts falls into the sea. Ash from eruptions drifts across oceans and settles. Tiny shells of plankton build layers, their chemistry recording the temperature and composition of the water they lived in. If humans have ever altered the seas in unusual ways, whether through pollution, metallurgy, or even by launching machines that later found their way into the depths, the signs might still be written there, preserved in quiet darkness. Now let us pause for a moment on the mechanisms of endurance. The seabed is like a great filing system, where time sorts itself naturally. New material covers old, protecting it. Oxygen is scarce in the deep, slowing decay. Objects lost to the depths may be buried quickly, shielded from currents. In this way, the oceans keep secrets far longer than the land, where wind, rain, and shifting ground erase so much. Yet here we must acknowledge limit. The oceans are vast and largely unexplored. We have mapped only a fraction of the seafloor, and sampled even less. What lies beneath miles of water may never be seen. Tectonic shifts may bury or destroy old layers. And even when anomalies are found, unusual metal concentrations, fragments of materials, they are often hard to interpret. Natural processes can mimic human signatures. A spike of iron may come from a meteor as easily as from smelting. A fragment of alloy may fall from a volcanic vent as well as from a machine. The language of the ocean's memory is subtle, not always clear. Still, we can think of the traces that are known. In certain places, sediments reveal increased soot at times when land was burned. In others, metals appear suddenly, linked to human activity on shore. Even plastics, now drifting across seas, are beginning to settle into sediment, forming a layer that will mark our own age. If such layers exist now, it is possible they could have existed before, even if we no longer recognize them. Let us take a thought experiment. Imagine a culture living long ago, skilled in working with fire and metal. Their rivers carry waste into the sea, soot, slag, chemicals. On the shore, machines rust and break, some falling into the depths. For a time, their activity leaves signals, written in sediments as thin dark bands, or unusual enrichments in elements. Then the culture fades. Their shores erode, their artifacts corrode, their cities vanish. But the signals remain buried. Thousands of years later, the band of soot or metal is still there, pressed into the mud of the seafloor, silent but real. Extend the experiment further. Imagine hundreds of thousands of years. Continents shift, seas rise and fall, yet many sediments remain, sealed under layers of new material. The signals are still present, though faint. To us, they might appear as anomalies, puzzling but inconclusive. Natural or human? The answer would be uncertain. And yet, the traces would still be there, faint whispers of something unusual that once touched the oceans. From this reflection we may draw a gentle conclusion. The seas are not only barriers but also keepers of memory. They hide much, but they also preserve much, shielding traces from the erasure of time. What lies beneath their vast silence may never be fully known. The absence of discovery does not prove absence of history. It only reminds us how small our reach is compared to the scale of the oceans. As we rest with this thought, we may feel the quiet patience of the sea itself, holding its archives without urgency, waiting without revealing, keeping in its depths both the ordinary rhythms of earth and perhaps, just perhaps, the faint shadows of forgotten ages. What if some of the most enduring traces of forgotten ages are hidden not in ruins or artifacts, but in the chemistry of the rocks themselves, where elements and isotopes form a quiet record of change? Let us soften into this thought, for rocks, though seemingly still, are among the most patient storytellers of the earth. They are layered like pages, each one pressed with signs of the time it was formed. When molten stone cools, it traps signals. When rivers deposit minerals, they leave signatures. Over millions of years, these signatures remain, faint but steady. By studying them, we glimpse both natural rhythms and unusual anomalies, each whispering of conditions long gone. Now we may pause gently on the scale of these archives. Geological layers are vast, stretching across continents. Within them, we find isotopes, forms of elements with different weights, that act like clock. Uranium slowly becomes lead, carbon decays into nitrogen, each at a steady rate. By measuring these, we tell time. But isotopes can also tell of sudden events. A rise in certain metals may suggest volcanic eruptions. A spike in carbon isotopes may suggest burning on a massive scale. Even without artifacts, these anomalies can show that something unusual once disturbed the balance of the Earth. Yet here we meet the limits of interpretation. A change in isotopes may come from natural processes. Volcanoes, meteor impacts, or sudden climate shifts can create signals similar to those of human activity. When we find layers enriched with metals, or sudden spikes of soot, we cannot always separate natural from artificial causes. The archive of the rocks speaks in numbers, not in words. Its language is precise but ambiguous. We must hold our conclusions gently, knowing absence of certainty is not certainty of absence. Let us consider the language of these traces more closely. In Greenland ice and in deep-sea sediments, we see increases in lead and copper, linked to ancient smelting. In some soils, we find evidence of carbon isotopes shifted by large-scale farming and burning. These are not direct artifacts, but chemical shadows of human presence. If earlier civilizations had reached further, if they had burned more, mined more, or even used unfamiliar processes, their signals might still be faintly present as anomalies in stone, soil, and sediment. A thought experiment may help us follow this further. Imagine a civilization that mastered metallurgy on a great scale. For centuries, they mined and smelted, releasing metals into air and water. These metals settled into soils, into riverbeds, into the ocean floor. The civilization fades. Their structures collapse, their tools corrode, their memory is lost. Yet in the chemistry of the earth, a thin line remains, a layer richer in lead, in mercury, in other metals. Thousands of years later, the layer is still there. We measure it, puzzled by its sudden rise, uncertain whether it was caused by volcanoes or by human hands. Now stretch the experiment across 1,000,000 years. Continents shift, mountains rise and erode, oceans spread. Many layers are buried, yet some remain. In them, isotopic anomalies endure. They show that at one moment, briefly, something unusual happened. To us, the origin is unclear. Was it natural? Was it cultural? The answer fades with time, but the signal remains as a quiet reminder of possibility. From this reflection we may rest with a gentle understanding. Rocks and isotopes are not storytellers of detail. They cannot describe machines or monuments, but they carry signals of change, quiet and impartial. They remind us that every action leaves a chemical shadow, and that shadows may last longer than objects. If extraordinary things ever happened in forgotten ages, their memory may survive not in artifacts but in isotopic whispers, waiting in stone for those who know how to listen. We close softly here, aware that the earth itself is always recording, not in words or images, but in the quiet shifting of elements. Its language is subtle, but enduring, reminding us that what we cannot see directly may still leave traces that last far beyond our imagination. What if traces of forgotten ages are hidden not in stone or soil, but in the very stars, in signals that may have traveled for centuries across space before fading into silence? Let us rest for a moment with this thought, for the cosmos is not only vast in distance, but also in time. Light and radio waves carry messages across the dark, and once sent, they travel endlessly unless absorbed. If in some earlier age humanity had reached the capacity to send signals outward, or even if natural events inspired people to experiment with forms of transmission, faint echoes of those efforts might still be drifting, scattered among the stars. Now we pause on the mechanisms of these signals. Radio waves are simply a form of light, though invisible to the eye. They spread outward like ripples in water, weakening as they travel. A strong signal can cross great distances, but the farther it goes, the fainter it becomes. After centuries, it is almost indistinguishable from background noise. Yet in theory, even the weakest signal still exists, somewhere, traveling on. In this way, the universe becomes an archive of all transmissions, though scattered and faint. But here we must recognize the limit. Our instruments are sensitive, but not infinitely so. Signals degrade, are masked by cosmic radiation, are lost in the vastness. And we cannot be sure whether earlier cultures, if they existed, would have chosen or even discovered the same frequencies we use today. The absence of detected signals does not mean absence of attempts. It may mean only that what was sent has faded beyond our reach. The language of traces in the sky is subtle. We search for unusual patterns of light, for narrowband radio emissions, for rhythms that seem too regular to be natural. Sometimes we find anomalies, brief signals that do not repeat, unexplained but inconclusive. They could be interference, they could be natural event, or perhaps they could be faint remnants of something older. Without repetition we cannot know. But their presence reminds us that the sky is filled with signals, most of which we do not yet understand. Let us try a thought experiment. Imagine a culture long ago, perhaps not advanced in all areas, but curious about the sky. They discover ways to send strong bursts of energy, crude by our standards, but enough to leave the atmosphere. For a few decades they experiment. The signals spread outward, moving at the speed of light. Then the culture collapses and the transmissions stop. Thousands of years later, the machines are gone, the people are forgotten, but the signals are still moving, like ripples from a stone thrown into a pond. Somewhere, hundreds of light years away, those signals are still passing by, silent witnesses of a moment now erased on Earth. Extend the experiment further. Imagine that in another 1,000 years, our own instruments grow more sensitive, capable of detecting faint echoes hidden in the background. We search the sky and find a pattern, an ancient burst, long since stopped, arriving now from the past. To us, it would be a puzzle. It might not carry meaning we could decode, but its presence alone would suggest a forgotten moment of contact with the stars. Whether from us or from another, we could not say. From this reflection, we can rest with a quiet conclusion. The cosmos is not empty. It is a patient archive filled with light, waves, and signals, many of which have traveled longer than human history itself. We have not yet found decisive proof of forgotten transmissions, but absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. The silence we hear may be the result of time, distance, or fragility. And yet, the possibility remains open, as wide as the sky. As we pause here, we may feel the vastness of the universe pressing softly against us, reminding us that memory can exist not only in stone and soil, but in the very fabric of light itself, carrying whispers of what once was, long after the senders are gone. What if the signs of forgotten journeys lie not in ruins or records, but in subtle shifts of biology, carried within the fabric of life itself? Let us rest with this possibility, for living organisms like rocks or ice are also archives. DNA, the long molecule that encodes life, is not only a script for building bodies, but also a memory of past conditions. It carries traces of adaptation, of exposure, of sudden change. In this way, the story of Earth's life is written into the very cells of plants, animals, and us. Now let us pause gently on the scale of this memory. DNA changes slowly over time, through mutations and adaptations. Most of these changes are small, but together they form a history. By comparing DNA across species, we can see migrations, extinctions, and encounters with new environments. Sometimes we find anomalies, changes that appear sudden, as if driven by events that left no other trace. These genetic markers are indirect, but they are enduring, preserved across generations like faint imprints pressed into clay. The mechanism is simple, though quiet. When an organism is exposed to radiation or chemicals or unusual conditions, its DNA may change. Some of those changes are harmful and vanish, but others remain, carried forward. Over millennia, these changes become part of the record. When we study DNA today, we are not only seeing the blueprint of life, but also an archive of what life once endured. Yet here we encounter limits. DNA is fragile. It degrades after death, and only under special conditions does it survive long enough for us to read. Most ancient DNA we study is no older than tens of thousands of years, a blink in geological time. Beyond that, direct sequences are lost. What remains are patterns in living species, clues scattered across the tree of life. And these patterns can be interpreted in many ways. An unusual mutation may come from natural radiation, or from volcanic gases, or from human influence. We cannot always tell. Still, there is a language of traces in biology. In humans, we see sudden expansions of certain genetic groups, suggesting migrations or population bottleneck. In plants, we see adaptations that hint at ancient climate. In animals, we find evidence of exposure to heavy metals or toxins long before industrial times. These are not proofs of advanced civilizations, but they remind us that life carries imprints of conditions we may no longer see in the soil or stone. Now let us take a thought experiment. Imagine a forgotten culture that reached a level of technology unknown to us. For a time, they used energy sources that released radiation or chemicals that spread through air and water. Their tools and cities vanish, but their influence lingers. Plants and animals living nearby adapt, their DNA altered by exposure. Centuries pass, the culture is gone, but the genetic changes remain, carried quietly through generations. Thousands of years later, when we study the DNA of those lineages, we find anomalies, patterns that do not fit the climate or geology we know. We puzzle over them, unable to explain fully, yet aware that something unusual must have happened. Extend this further. Imagine millions of years. Species evolve, some vanish, but fragments of those unusual adaptations may echo faintly in the descendants that remain. Perhaps in a gene for resilience, or in a tolerance for metals, or in resistance to radiation. To us, these would appear as curiosities, difficult to explain, perhaps dismissed as chance. Yet they would still be quiet shadows of something long gone. From this reflection we may rest with a gentle conclusion. Life itself is a recorder, carrying imprints of past conditions in its very fabric. DNA is fragile, yet also enduring in its patterns, offering hints of what once was, even when all else has disappeared. We cannot claim certainty, but we can recognize that the memory of the Earth is not only geological or cultural, but also biological. And so we pause, aware that in the breath of a tree, in the lineage of an animal, in the code of our own cells, there may linger whispers of events and conditions that time has hidden, but not erased entirely. What if the faintest traces of forgotten ages are preserved not in grand monuments or distant stars, but in the quiet mathematics of probability, in patterns that emerge when we step back and look at history as a whole? Let us linger with this idea, for numbers, though abstract, can sometimes reveal rhythms invisible in individual events. When we count the rise and fall of civilizations, when we study the cycles of growth, collapse, and renewal, we may glimpse recurring shapes, patterns that hint at deeper structures beneath the surface. These are not stories in stone, but curves on a graph, yet they too may whisper of possibilities hidden in the flow of time. Now we pause gently on the context. Human history, as we know it, stretches for only a few thousand years of written record. Beyond that lies prehistory, far longer, filled with silence. Within that silence, civilizations may have risen and fallen without leaving lasting monuments. But mathematics allows us to imagine likelihoods, to estimate what might be missing. Just as we can predict the average life of stars or the rhythm of earthquakes, we can also look for statistical gaps in our knowledge of humanity. The mechanism is simple. We gather data from what is known, the rise of agriculture, the spread of metallurgy, the timing of collapses, and then we compare. If patterns repeat in ways that suggest cycles longer than our recorded history, we may suspect that what we see is only the latest turn of a larger wheel. This does not prove that forgotten ages existed, but it suggests space where they might fit. Yet here we must accept limits. Statistics cannot create evidence where none exists. A pattern in numbers may reflect real cycles, or it may be coincidence. When we say that civilizations tend to rise every few thousand years, we are speaking of tendencies, not certainties. The absence of clear data means we must hold our conclusions lightly, recognizing that mathematics is a guide, not a proof. Still, the language of probability offers subtle traces. The recurrence of certain timelines, the clustering of collapses around similar spans, the repetition of growth rates, creates a sense of rhythm. The distribution of technological leaps, too, is uneven. Long ages of apparent stagnation are followed by sudden accelerations. These discontinuities are themselves a kind of marker, suggesting that history does not move in a straight line, but in waves, some of which may now be hidden beneath layers of time. Let us try a thought experiment. Imagine we chart all known civilizations on a timeline, from the earliest farming villages to the great empires. We see clusters, peaks, and valleys. Now imagine that our record is incomplete, that some clusters are missing because their traces were erased. The overall pattern would still suggest their existence, even if the details are lost. Mathematics would whisper, something should be here, like a missing step in a rhythm. Extend this further. Suppose we study population growth, energy use, or technological pace. We notice that certain accelerations seem too abrupt, as if built on forgotten foundations. If one culture had risen before, leaving knowledge that was faintly remembered, the curve might look the same, a sudden leap unexplained by what came before. To us, it would appear as an anomaly, but perhaps it is the echo of an earlier wave. From this reflection we may rest with a gentle conclusion. Probability is not evidence, but it is a way of listening to silence. It tells us where gaps may be, where rhythms suggest missing note. The absence of certainty remains, but the patterns invite us to wonder whether humanity's story is longer, richer, and more cyclical than our records show. And so we pause, aware that even in the quiet language of numbers, we may find soft reminders that what we know is not all there is, and that the great arc of time may hold more turns than we can now see. What if the signs of forgotten ages are hidden not in the ground beneath us or the stars above, but in the myths and stories that traveled across generations, reshaped yet enduring? Let us stay with this thought, for human memory does not live only in objects. It also lives in tales, symbols, and rituals, passed from voice to voice, often changing form but carrying something of their origin. These myths are like echoes in a valley, distorted, softened, but still reflections of a sound once made. Now we pause gently on context. Every culture holds myths of creation, floods, journeys to the sky, beings who brought knowledge from above or below. These stories may be metaphors, may be symbolic, may be purely imaginative. Yet when the same motifs appear in distant places, across lands separated by oceans, we are invited to wonder whether they preserve fragments of deeper memory. Not memory of precise events, but of impressions, unusual sights, great changes, or encounters that left a mark too strong to vanish entirely. The mechanism of such endurance is simple but fragile. Oral tradition is like a thread, woven from generation to generation. Each telling reshapes it, but some elements persist. A pattern, a symbol, a rhythm. Over centuries, details blur, but the core remains. A flood becomes a myth of cleansing. A bright object in the sky becomes a chariot of fire. A vanished people become gods or giants. The story survives long after the event is forgotten. Yet here we must pause with humility. Myths are not records. They cannot be read like documents. They mix imagination, symbolism, and culture. A flood myth may reflect an actual inundation, or it may reflect psychological fears. A sky journey may describe a comet, or it may describe an inner vision. We cannot know for sure. What we can say is that myths are archives of human experience, but written in the language of metaphor, not fact. Now let us linger on the language of these traces. Across the world, we find recurring themes: great floods, lost lands, fiery visitors, knowledge given from the stars. In some traditions, there are tales of metal birds, of burning wheels, of towers reaching the sky. To read these literally would be careless, but to dismiss them entirely may also miss their subtle role. They are shadows of experiences, stored not in stone but in story. If there were forgotten moments of unusual contact with the sky or with advanced knowledge, myths might be the last place where their memory lingers. Let us try a thought experiment. Imagine a community that once saw a great object descend from the sky. Perhaps it was natural, a comet, a meteor. Or perhaps it was artificial, a machine from a culture now forgotten. The event frightens and inspires. People retell the story. Over time, the object becomes a god, the descent becomes a chariot, the memory becomes a ritual. Centuries pass. The object is gone, but the myth remains. To later generations, it is only a tale, but within it lies a faint echo of something once real. Extend the experiment further. Imagine that such stories arise in many places, shaped differently but carrying similar images. Fire from the sky, teachers from above, lost lands swallowed by the sea. The stories are told for thousands of years, long after the events are gone. When we study them, we see patterns. We cannot know if they are coincidence, or if they carry distant memories of real but forgotten experiences. Yet their persistence is itself a kind of trace, a marker of events powerful enough to survive in human imagination. From this reflection we may rest with a gentle conclusion. Myths are not proofs, but they are signals. They remind us that memory can survive not only in matter, but also in symbol. The absence of clear evidence does not erase the possibility that myths may carry whispers of realities long lost. They are soft echoes of human experience, blurred and reshaped, but still present. And so we pause, aware that the stories told in hushed voices by firelight may be as much a part of our hidden history as the stones buried deep in the ground. What if the traces of forgotten journeys lie not in the earth beneath us, nor in the myths we tell, but in the sky above, written in the steady rhythm of the stars? Let us soften into this thought, for the heavens have always been a canvas for human imagination. Constellations, calendars, and alignments with celestial bodies have guided us for millennia. Yet they may also serve as quiet markers, pointing to the possibility that earlier cultures watched the skies with a precision that seems unusual for their time. Now we pause gently on context. Across the world, from stone circles to temple complexes, we find ancient structures aligned with solstices, equinoxes, or the rising of particular stars. These alignments are not accidents. They suggest careful observation, repeated across generations. To measure such cycles requires patience and continuity, qualities not easy to sustain. When we see this pattern in many places, we may wonder if astronomy was not only practical, but also a way of preserving memory of events or of knowledge that had to be passed on. The mechanism is simple. By aligning structures to celestial events, people could ensure that even if spoken words were lost, the sky itself would preserve the message. A temple facing the sunrise on the longest day is a calendar carved into stone. A pyramid pointing to a star is both monument and marker. Over centuries, even if the culture collapses, the alignment remains, quietly keeping time. Yet we must be careful. Alignments are open to interpretation. A line of stones may point to a solstice, or it may simply follow the landscape. A pyramid may align with a star by design, or by coincidence. Without clear records, we cannot be certain. The absence of evidence for intention does not prove absence of intention, but nor does alignment alone prove advanced knowledge. Here we find again the delicate balance of possibility. Still, the language of celestial traces is intriguing. In some places, the precision is remarkable, far beyond what would seem necessary for agriculture alone. Monuments track lunar cycles, eclipses, even slow shifts in the stars caused by Earth's wobble over thousands of years. These are not simple observations. They are long projects, requiring patience across generations. If such precision was once common, it may hint at traditions of knowledge now mostly lost. Now let us take a thought experiment. Imagine a culture many thousands of years ago, with a deep interest in the sky. They build markers, circles of stone, lines of earth, towers aligned with stars. Their goal may not be practical farming, but something else. Perhaps to remember, perhaps to signal, perhaps to reach toward the sky in ways we no longer understand. Their culture fades. The stones fall, the wood rots, but the alignments remain. Thousands of years later, we rediscover them. We measure their orientations and realize they point precisely to solstices or eclipses long past. To us, they seem mysterious, yet they are echoes of intention, preserved in the geometry of sky and stone. Extend this experiment further. Imagine that some of these alignments were not simply agricultural, but responses to unusual events. A bright comet, a new star, something striking enough to engrave into memory. Over time, the event fades, but the monument remains, a silent witness to something extraordinary. We may not know the story, but the direction, the angle, the placement may carry its shadow. From this reflection, we may rest with a gentle conclusion. The stars themselves are timeless, but human responses to them are fragile. Yet sometimes, across thousands of years, these responses endure in stone and earth. They remind us that we are not the first to look upward with wonder, nor perhaps the first to wonder what lies beyond. The alignments whisper of patience, of knowledge carried across generations, of possibilities we may never fully grasp. And so we pause, aware that the sky, which we still share with all who came before, may hold not only the future of our journeys, but also faint and quiet memories of ages already forgotten. What if the story of humanity is not a straight line, but a tapestry woven from threads we can see and others we can only sense, some bright, some faded, some perhaps lost altogether? Let us settle softly with this thought, for it is a reminder of the vastness of time, and of how small a part of it we truly know. Written history is but a thin layer, stretching back only a few thousand years. Beneath it lie countless generations, perhaps entire cultures, whose names and deeds have vanished like footprints washed away by the tide. And yet, even when the footprints are gone, the shore still remembers in its shape, in its sands, in its subtle traces. Now we pause gently on context. Earth itself is billions of years old. Life has thrived here for hundreds of millions. Humans, as a species, have existed for only a brief moment in comparison, and civilizations for an even shorter span. To imagine that no other ages of knowledge could have risen and fallen before is both cautious and limiting. The scale of time is wide enough to hold forgotten chapters. Still, we must walk carefully, acknowledging what we do not know. The mechanism by which memories fade is simple. Materials decay. Metals rust. Wood rots. Even stone, over millennia, wears away. Entire landscapes can vanish under oceans or ice. When we look back, we see only fragments, scattered and incomplete. It is like trying to reconstruct a long book from a few pages, knowing that most of the chapters are gone. Yet the absence of those pages does not mean they were never written. We must live with uncertainty, and read the silence with care. Now let us notice the language of traces. We find it in geology, in isotopes and sediments that record ancient fires, floods, and shift. We find it in biology, in DNA that carries echoes of environments long past. We find it in myths, where fragments of memory survive as symbols. And sometimes we find it in alignments of monuments, or in anomalies of data, where something does not quite fit the pattern we expect. None of these are proofs, but together they suggest that history may be larger than the part we see. Let us try a thought experiment. Imagine that a culture long ago reached knowledge of the skies, of energy, of travel beyond the earth. For a time, they thrived. But as with all things, change came. Collapse, disaster, or quiet dissolution erased their work. Time carried on. Millennia passed. Their machines rusted, their records decayed. Yet in the soil, in the stories, in subtle shifts of life, faint echoes endured. Much later, another humanity rose, building anew, unaware of what had come before. Extend this experiment further. Imagine us, many thousands of years from now. If our cities were lost, if our records decayed, what would remain? A few traces in geology, a spike of carbon, of plastics, of metals. A few myths, perhaps, transformed beyond recognition. The rest would vanish. Future beings might wonder whether there had once been an age of flight and space travel. Some might believe, others doubt. The silence would hold more than it revealed. And so we come to a quiet conclusion. We cannot claim certainty about forgotten ages, nor about journeys to space in times before memory. What we can say is that the possibility remains open, sheltered within the vastness of time and the fragility of evidence. The earth remembers, though its language is subtle, and much of what it says is incomplete. For us, the task is not to insist, but to listen, to accept that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, and that wonder has its place alongside caution. As we pause here, we may feel both humility and comfort. The universe is wide, time is deep, and our place within them is small but meaningful. Perhaps there were forgotten journeys before ours. Perhaps not. Either way, we are part of the same great unfolding, carried along by currents older than memory. And if this rhythm, slow and reflective, feels close to us, we already know how to carry it further.